Okay, show of hands. How many of you in your 30s, 40s, or older had Magnavox's Odyssey 2 hooked up to your living room console TV growing up? Okay, if you have your hands up, put them down because I can't see them. But regardless of your hand's former position, do stick around because we're going to take a look at this behemoth of a retro video game console system on today's somewhat depressing episode of Happy Days.
The electronic game of the future, and the family's best foul-weather friend.
In September of 1972, Magnavox would usher in the beginning of the video game industry with the release of the Odyssey. This sophisticated piece of hardware, developed by a small team headed up by renowned engineer and inventor Ralph Baer, was the first of its kind, an electronic device that allowed users to manipulate the images presented on the display, even if it were only a handful of squares. The Odyssey was very much unlike home video games as we'd eventually come to recognize them. The game cards were merely jumpers for the electronics inside, changing the behavior of the three squares to play different types of games that utilized the included playing pieces, not unlike a board game. And in lieu of actual graphics, users affixed plastic overlays. Remember those? While it did manage to sell 350,000 units by the time it was discontinued in 1975, the Odyssey wasn't what you would call a runaway success. The price tag certainly didn't help. At $100 for the console, which is like $50,000 in today's money, it was a ridiculously pricey way to play a game of Simon Says and other likewise simplistic games. Also, many consumers were under the belief that the device would only work on Magnavox brand televisions. It was an understandable mistake considering the Odyssey was only sold through official Magnavox dealers for a while. Following the original Odyssey's demise, Magnavox would continue using the name for a line of dedicated consoles not unlike the Pong clones flooding the market at the time. Although it should be noted that the various paddle and ball games found on the original Odyssey predate Pong, to the point that Atari and various other third parties making such clones were sued. Magnavox enjoyed additional substantial revenue between the various settlements and royalty payments.
Fairchild Video Entertainment System at your larger JCPenney. The home entertainment system that never gets old. Plug in a new video card and change the fun.
During that period between 1975 and 1978, home video games began a slow but significant evolution. The period of single-game consoles was coming to an end. With the introduction of the Fairchild Channel F in 1976 came the era of hardware with central processing units that could accept a wide array of game cartridges. RCA would follow suit with their Studio 2 console in early 1977, as well as Atari with their VCS and Bally's Professional Arcade later that same year.
Odyssey, video game fun, computer keyboard challenge, the entrance to an alternate world of fire-breathing dragons, hard-hitting sluggers, arcade wizards, outer space wizards. More than 40 games in all.
Magnavox decided it was time to enter the microprocessor age and released the de facto follow-up to their Odyssey, the Odyssey 2, or Odyssey², in early 1979 or 78 depending on your source and location. Although somewhat graphically inferior to Atari's hardware, Magnavox's design added an alphanumeric membrane keyboard to allow for a wide array of applications and gaming options, even rudimentary programming with the appropriate software cartridge running. The keyboard does have its drawbacks though. Chief among them is the girth that it adds to the overall design of the console. Seriously, crack it open and you'll see there's tons of empty space in there. And while the keyboard does lend itself well to types of games that you would not find on other consoles, it does feel like needlessly wasted space. Visually, the joysticks for the Odyssey 2 are reminiscent of the ones you'd find on Atari's video computer system. That is, 8 directions with a single action button in the upper left-hand corner for your thumb. However, it has a way different feel. The stick itself is shorter with more resistance inside. You can practically feel the strong springs recentering it. It also has infinitely more travel with indented restrictors on the end of each direction. This does allow for more accurate positioning, but at the expense of slowing down quick direction changes. Oh, and if you have an Odyssey 2 that wasn't part of the initial batch, your joysticks are semi-permanently attached. However, if you crack open the console, which as I showed you before is quite easy to do, you can replace them if necessary. And with minimal effort, you could hack this console to add some standard 9-pin ports that will allow you to use your favorite compatible joystick. An interesting oddity about the games is the way they were packaged. First and foremost, every game ended with an exclamation point just to make sure it conveyed that level of excitement you were expected to have long before you even plugged the cartridge in. The only proper pronunciation for these titles are to scream them. Also, the cartridges had these little handles on them like little tiny lunchboxes of fun, though it would be more likely that Magnavox overestimated the amount of force required to extract the cartridge and provided that handle as a just in case. And it behooves me to point out that the barely readable rainbow text found in the inner flap of the gatefold boxes gives the entire package an air of futuristic wonderment. Perhaps we'll plug in a few cartridges and see what the Odyssey 2 has to offer. KC Munchkin, released in 1981, is the game most people would remember, mostly due to the legal controversy that ensued shortly after its release. Atari claimed that the gameplay was a tad too close to that of Pac-Man, and Atari had exclusive rights for the first home version for their 2600 console that was to be released the following year. Atari proved victorious in appeal, and all further shipments of the game ceased, although by this time, the game had sold plenty of copies. Upon closer inspection of KC Munchkin, there's really not much more similarity to Pac-Man than many of the other maze games available around the same time. As a matter of fact, the behavior of the monsters, the limited number of dots, and even the randomness of the maze layouts provide a rather unique alternative to the more traditional Namco classic. Freedom Fighters is your basic simplistic space shooter. This game suitably illustrates some of the confusion found in second-generation games, particularly without a manual handy. I thought my game was broken, but I learned I had to press reset in order to play a single-player game. But once I got it figured out, I still wasn't entirely sure it was 100% operational. Pickaxe Pete is another somewhat memorable game that's similar in many ways to Donkey Kong, but then again, not really. You have a pickaxe that destroys all the boulders but wears out after a while. When a couple of boulders collide, you can either retrieve a new pickaxe or collect a key to move on to a new level to do the same thing over again. Not terribly deep or engaging, but somewhat fun. This odd combination cartridge of Speedway, Spin-Out, and Crypto Logic seems like the product of questionable decisions. I could see the motif 2 games in, with Speedway and Spin-Out both being racing games, but then why add a game about trying to unscramble words your friend created? Seems like an afterthought, like they had just enough room for a lackluster word game that likely never got played. Still, Spin-Out can be quite amusing with 2 players. Alien Invaders Plus seems like a typical Space Invaders clone at first blush, but it actually plays a bit differently, albeit not necessarily better. You're a robot attempting to destroy the invading enemies. Your shields repel all enemy fire, but if you're hit, you have to scramble and use one of those black squares to create a new $100,000 pyramid, with which you use to continue your fight. Showdown in 2100 AD is a unique title in that it doesn't have an exclamation point and thus must be whispered. It's much like Atari's Outlaw, where you have to shoot your opponent before he shoots you. UFO is another simple little shooting game where you destroy as much as you can before you get blown apart. As you could see, many of these games were fairly simplistic. There was little initial interest by Magnavox to really create anything groundbreaking, seeing as their bread and butter was in stereos and televisions. Most of the original games were programmed by one man, Sam Overton. It was only when Magnavox threatened to pull the plug on the console prior to its release did Intel programmer Ed Averitt step in as an additional programmer. These 2 men were responsible for much of the Odyssey 2's library, and while what they accomplished is impressive, the overall quality of the library does suffer a bit due to the limited number of contributors. And where the Odyssey 2 suffered most was its lack of third-party support. While this did give Magnavox more control over their software, this limitation also left consumers fewer reasons to buy into their hardware. By the end of its life in 1984, only iMagic offered up a contribution to the console with Demon Attack. Though in Europe, the Odyssey 2, known as the Philips Video Pack, enjoyed much more success, which led to some exclusive European ports of Parker Brothers' most popular titles, such as Frogger, Popeye, and Q*bert. Magnavox did make a few board/video game hybrids that included playing pieces, lavishly illustrated game boards, and sometimes even an overlay that went over the keyboard, all packaged in attractive, oversized boxes. Also of note is the voice add-on released in 1982 that added more complex sound effects and even digitized voice to many games. Unlike the IntelliVoice add-on from Mattel's Intellivision, released that same year, the voice merely enhanced games, meaning most of them were still fully playable without the add-on. The added sound from the voice module came directly from the unit that fit quite snugly over the Odyssey². Some games that used the voice add-on to great effect included Casey's Crazy Chase,
Oh no!
Turtles, and Attack of the Time Lord.
Defend your world.
The Odyssey² was to have a follow-up, appropriately called the Odyssey3, or Cubed if you will, which promised things like backwards compatibility, a Laserdisc player interface, and real mechanical keyboard. It was released, sort of, in Europe under the Philips Video Pack branding as the G7400, but only in limited quantities. The increase in technological leaps of Magnavox's competitors, coupled with the North American video game crash of 1983, effectively ended their run as a video game hardware manufacturer. Even though it lasted a good 6 years, the Odyssey² was overshadowed by both Atari and Mattel during its life, and then later Coleco. And with its limited library consisting of practically zero arcade ports and almost non-existent third-party contributions, it's no wonder this console is often overlooked. On the bright side, if you come across one, you could probably get it for super cheap. This was Dave for TeeVee Games. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Because why not? I'll see you next time.
And you are sweating.
Incredible.